Members of the jury, the verdict.
After months of public silence, the Ramseys speak out. The parents of 6-year-old murder victim JonBenet say they didn't kill their daughter. Hello and welcome to Crime and Punishment, and our focus, the murder of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey. John and Patsy Ramsey have given an extensive interview for a British television documentary. And during this hour, we'll examine what they said and how they said it. We'll talk with a producer of that documentary from London. We'll also hear from a columnist at the Denver Post who's followed this story from the beginning. And a forensic psychologist will give us his take on why this case is so hard to crack. Plus, I'll be joined by lawyers with both the prosecution and defense point of view. First, a little background. More than a year and a half after their daughter's murder, the Ramseys are attacking the American media, saying unfair news accounts have many believing that they are the killers. Now, of course, the Ramseys are not charged with any crimes, nor are they the only potential suspects. But they are still the only ones identified by a police department that claims to be narrowing in on the killer or killers.
I have an idea of who did it, yes.
If he's referring to John and Patsy Ramsey, John Ramsey has an answer. In a British television interview, he says in no uncertain terms, "I would have given my life for JonBenet. I regret and will regret for the rest of my life that I wasn't able to that night." What we know for sure is that police responded to a call that JonBenet Ramsey had been kidnapped. They read a ransom note and quickly searched the Ramseys' Boulder, Colorado home, but not the basement, where 6-year-old JonBenet's bludgeoned and strangled body would later be found. By early afternoon, a police detective saying she wanted to give John Ramsey something to do asked him to search the house again. He found his daughter's body, ripped the duct tape off her mouth, and carried her upstairs, potentially contaminating the evidence and the crime scene. In the British television documentary, Ramsey says, "The American public has been led to believe that we went to bed that night after a wonderful Christmas, brutally beat JonBenet, sexually molested her, strangled her, went to sleep, got up the next morning, wrote a 3-page ransom note, called the police, sat around the house for 4 hours, and then I went downstairs and discovered her body and was able to act distraught. Help me understand that." Now Ramsey wants everyone to understand that he's been railroaded by the Boulder police and by the media.
The American press has been all over this story. Every fact that the press can find, they've printed, and a lot of things that weren't fact, they printed. If the Ramseys are doing anything, what they are doing is they are saying, we have a complaint. And the American press doesn't seem to be too willing to air complaints about itself.
Maybe so, but the American news media were more than willing to air the Ramseys' last public comments on May 1st, 1997.
To those of you who may want to ask, let me address very directly, I did not kill my daughter, JonBenet.
Let me assure you that I did not kill JonBenet. I did not have anything to do with it.
Joining us now from Denver is a columnist for the Denver Post, Chuck Green, who's been following this case, has written dozens of columns about this case, and who's heard an audio tape of that interview. Chuck, thanks for joining us. Chuck, let me just ask you first, what's your take on the tape?
Well, the tape, first of all, contains virtually nothing new. There's no news in the tape. The tape is primarily a forum for the Ramseys to once again declare their innocence, and for the producers of this so-called documentary to assault the press coverage of the Ramsey case.
And you sound somewhat critical of the documentary. What's the matter with that? Why shouldn't the Ramseys be able to go to England, do this documentary, have them put together, and have it be a critique of us?
There's no problem with that whatsoever. And in the introduction piece there, it said that the American media, the television networks essentially, is reluctant to criticize itself. That's not the question here. The question is, are they willing to pay up to $1 million to buy a program that holds the American media up to scrutiny? If this was a news program or a legitimate documentary, it would be aired. But it is a commercial production, and a New York agent representing the TV producers are asking up to $1 million for an American network to air this. That's the question.
All right, but let's talk about
if they were to make it available for broadcast tomorrow, it would be on the air.
Well, let's talk about the substance, though. I mean, they are critiquing the American media. The Ramseys are lashing out at the American media. You are one of the people at the forefront of covering this case. Can you see why the Ramseys might say to themselves, or what the Ramseys might say, it's pretty clear from reading all the media accounts that everyone thinks we did it. If you talk to anyone out there, they think we did it because of how the media and you, Chuck Green, and others have reported it.
Well, they have some legitimate complaints about some of the coverage of this case. And some of the complaints that are aired in this documentary are quite valid. They are mostly contained in tabloid journalism, both print and broadcast. They do not represent the mainstream coverage of this case, but there are legitimate complaints, and I understand that. There's no problem there at all. The problem is that they, number one, say that it's the American media that has made them appear vulnerable as suspects in this case, when in fact it's the Boulder Police Department that has publicly identified them as being under the umbrella of suspicion in this case. That's where the evidence points.
But
it's not
Chuck,
just the American media making
wait
this up.
Wait a sec, Chuck. It's fair to say, though, that in the Richard Jules case, for example, you could say that the FBI gave them the exact same information which they used. Isn't there no obligation for the media and you and me to report this in an even-handed fashion?
Absolutely,
and not just to report everything we hear.
Absolutely, there is that obligation, and I think for the most part, the mainstream media has done that. Not only have we questioned the leaked information that has come from the prosecution or from the police department, but we have been very generous on the very few occasions that the Ramseys have wanted to appear and make their case. They have appeared on television live on every time they have requested that they appear. They have told their story on every occasion that they have asked to tell their story.
All right, Chuck, I want to bring I want to bring in David Mills. I'm sorry, Chuck.
Okay, but okay.
Let me just bring in David Mills. We were having some technical problems with him before. Right, Chuck.
Okay, but okay.
Let me just bring in David Mills. We were having some technical problems with him before, but he's joining us. He's the producer of the Ramsey documentary. Mr. Mills spent 5 days interviewing the couple earlier this year. Mr. Mills, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. First, let me ask you, what is this documentary about? Is it about the American media's coverage of the Ramsey case?
It is about the American media's coverage of the Ramsey case. It's much more about the media, both in America and Britain, than it is about the Ramseys in one way. But first of all, can I just have a go at what Chuck Green has just been saying? He has been commenting on this documentary with about as much accuracy as he's been commenting on the Ramsey case. To describe this as a commercial production is nonsense. None of the 7, 8 people who worked very hard on this for the last 6, 9 months are making anything out. Well, we're making a little bit out of it, but to describe it as a commercial production is nonsense. If anything, we had a financial incentive to find that there was evidence against the Ramseys, that there was a good case for the media, because we could then have sold the program to the highest bidder. In fact, we have to insist that whoever takes the program in the United States will follow the editorial line that we believe in, rather than the one which is financially convenient to us.
And of course, you're referring to the fact that you were trying to sell this in the United States. And let me ask you a question about that.
We will give the program away if necessary to get what it's actually trying to say over, rather than giving it as material for someone who will actually try to distort what
What is your concern that it be used as is, meaning it's a 75-minute documentary and it has to be used in exactly the form?
No. It is trying to raise a serious question about what is happening to the media both in America and in Britain. That the more that the market comes to dominate our actions as journalists, the more that we tend to move towards entertainment rather than news, the more we take on the rules of expediency rather than accuracy in reporting the news, and expediency to make the biggest profits for our employers and for our shareholders.
All right, let me ask you something. Hang on one second, Chuck. Chuck, hang on one second. Let me just ask you one question about the substance of what was said. It's clear that they said they didn't do it, again, in your documentary. Was there anything that struck you about what they said, which was particularly new, Chuck Green saying that there really isn't anything new with regard to the substance of what the Ramseys said in the interviews with you?
No, and of course the Ramseys are not going to be able to tell us anything which is going to prove that they're innocent. We are able to collaborate, as anyone could have done for the past 9 months, what they say, and we can show that wherever it is possible to collaborate what they say, we know that it stands up. But the Ramseys' own evidence is immaterial. Of course they're going to say they didn't do it. That's part of the problem that they face. Of course we interviewed them, of course we had them describing the story, but the documentary is not based upon what the Ramseys are telling us. It's based upon a very long investigation. We had 6, 7 people working in Colorado on this, and it is based upon the evidence that we discovered. It is not based upon the Ramseys. It is not based upon our opinions. It is based on what we discovered. And if we discovered different evidence, that is what we would have put in. And we would have been just as happy making a program saying that the Ramseys had done it if we had found that, as we are making a program saying that the evidence that the media has presented that they did it doesn't stand up.
Okay,
that's
Mr.
all we're saying.
We are going to talk more about what that evidence is or isn't, Chuck Green. I promise we will give you a chance to respond, and we're going to bring in our lawyers representing both the defense and prosecution perspective after we take this break. We'll be back in a minute.
Appalled that anyone would think that John or I would be involved in such a hideous, heinous crime.
Those bites back from May 1st of 1997, but the Ramseys have spoken out again, this time in a British television documentary. We've been talking with one of the producers of that documentary and with the Denver Post columnist Chuck Green. Chuck, I said I was going to give you an opportunity to respond to some of what David Mills had said, either about the documentary or about you. Go ahead.
Well, the primary point that he made was that I think that this is not a commercial venture that they did to make a bunch of money, and they're having a hard time getting anybody in the United States to broadcast their production. If they would make it available to TV stations in Denver free of charge, I guarantee it will be on Saturday night this weekend. The problem is they won't make it available for free. They insist on an overpriced product that nobody's willing to pay for. And in fact, I would ask you, Dan, wouldn't MSNBC be more than willing and eager to broadcast this thing if it was made available?
There is no chance.
Not at $1 million.
No chance I'm going to touch that one, Chuck. No way.
Okay.
But I do want to go back to Mr. Mills, who has admitted that this was a profit-making venture when it began. But Mr. Mills, let me ask you about the Ramseys.
Sorry, can I just? I'm awfully sorry. I just got to come back to what Chuck Green has said.
All right, quickly.
Again, he's talking about something he doesn't know. This documentary has been funded by British television Channel 4. They need to try to get some of that money back by selling it in other markets. This is the way television works. Of course we can't give it away in America.
Okay, let's end.
But again, Chuck Green is talking about areas he knows nothing.
All right.
Anyway, I do know something about this. Your co-producer, Michael Tracy, has complained that nobody in Denver will air this program. They will air it.
Chuck,
they just
I want to
won't
move
pay
on.
what you want for
Chuck,
it.
I want to move on to the substance of what the Ramseys were saying. We could talk forever about this documentary and whether you can sell it in the United States, but what may be more interesting to many people is the amount of time, Mr. Mills, you spent with the Ramseys, 5 days with them, probably unprecedented for an outsider. Give us your impression of the Ramseys, and of course, answer the question if you think they did it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And of course, this really did not play any part in any of the decisions we made about the documentary. It couldn't. I remember the first time I met John Ramsey, I thought to myself, am I in the company of a child killer? Like everybody else almost around the globe, I assumed that the parents were guilty from what I'd heard, what I'd read in the British press, reporting the American press. And our interest initially was not about whether the Ramseys were guilty or innocent. It was about the way that the media had covered the story. And as a journalist, you don't allow these sort of prejudices to get in the way. But I must admit, I was extraordinarily impressed by the Ramseys. They really are a delightful couple. I think that they're very different people. I think this is part of the problem that they've suffered, that people don't quite understand how someone like Patsy, coming from a very full-blooded cheerleading background can have such a happy relationship with someone like John Ramsey, whose dad was a war hero, who comes from a very much quieter, more middle-class sort of background. But they are a marvellous pairing of opposites, and the more you get to know them, the more inconceivable it becomes that they could have killed their daughter. So either that or they are consummate actors. I've been around as a journalist 30 years. Very few people, I think, to my knowledge, have ever managed a con me. If the Ramseys have con me, it is a job beyond anything that I've ever encountered or seen. They are not devious people.
All right. Let's ask our lawyers here whether it's possible that you might have been conned. Let's talk to defense attorney Geraldine Merritt, who is an MSNBC legal analyst and is out of Denver. Also out of Denver on the prosecution side, Norm Early, the former Denver district attorney. Thank you both for joining us. And Norm, you have actually heard the audio tape of this as well. Was Mr. Mills conned by the Ramseys?
Well, I don't know if he was conned or not because I don't know Mr. Mills. But I do know that you cannot look at someone, talk to someone, and gather an accurate impression of whether or not they committed a crime of this nature, especially when you don't know the content of the crime. We don't know if this was an accidental blow to the head with a premeditated cover-up, whether it was an intentional blow to the head. We don't know who might have struck this blow if it was struck by someone in the family. So without knowing the details of the crime, it's very, very difficult to make an assessment about whether these people could have committed it or not.
But Geraldine Merritt, it was a good venue, was it not, for the Ramseys to go and speak about this in the context of a story not about whether they did it, but about the media?
Certainly it was, and the reason that they went to Great Britain was because nobody in this country was covering the case fairly. They weren't looking for somebody to cover it favorably. They've been looking for somebody to cover it fairly. And in this country, we do have a presumption of innocence, and that presumption has been trashed in the media. And what I think this documentary is about is not who killed JonBenet, but the documentary is about how the media treated the Ramsey parents and how that presumption of innocence has not been accorded to them.
Well, I disagree with that for two reasons.
Very quickly, Norm.
The first is that this documentary dealt with a lot of things other than how they were treated in the media. And secondly, there were some questions which John answered that were never followed up, and they were patently ridiculous. The answers were patently ridiculous, like the sexualization of JonBenet, like the bedwetting issue, neither one of which was followed up, and we'd like to follow it up.
We're going to take a break. We will follow it up. We'll talk to Mr. Mills about it. We'll talk to Geraldine Merritt about it. We will continue this discussion after this break.
JonBenet and I had a very close relationship. I will miss her dearly for the rest of my life.
More of a press conference we're hearing there from John and Patsy Ramsey from May 1st of 1997. They're speaking out again, this time in a British documentary. I want to go back to the producer of that documentary, David Mills. Mr. Mills, one question I think a lot of people have is whether you followed up on some of the points the Ramseys made. Did you ask cross-examination-like pointed questions, which didn't just let them say things without following up and challenging them?
No, we took a decision quite early on that cross-examining the Ramseys was not going to take us anywhere. It was the background evidence that we had to spend all our time looking at. And on both the questions that have just been raised, sexualization in the pageants and the bedwetting, we did a lot of additional research on both of those. And we had a lot of additional evidence on camera that we could have put into the documentary. You have 50 minutes. You've got to make a choice as to what goes in, what goes out. There are always things that grieves us. I fought very, very hard with Channel 4 here in Britain to try to get more airtime for some more of the evidence so we could get it in, and we couldn't. It was a scheduling matter. You know how these things are on television. Yeah, but we did take the decision that we were not going to rely on what the Ramseys told us. Okay. And we obviously had them telling our story, and in the British version there's rather little of the Ramseys. And in the American version, where people want to meet them because they know much more about them than the people in Britain, we will obviously put a great deal more about the Ramseys into the American version of the program. But in the British version, there was relatively little about the Ramseys.
Norm Early, you heard that tape. Do you buy it?
No, I don't. I think that this tape was made with a predetermined attitude towards the media in this country, and it was set about to prove that the media had been unfair to the Ramseys. And if that was the purpose of the tape, then the questions that you ask and the things that you report and the things that you hear are skewed by the fact that that is your ultimate goal.
But that simply is not true. That simply is not true.
In the instance
can I just tell you the agreement we had with the Ramseys, and I repeated it to them to their face many times, that we would look at the question as to whether there had been distortion in the American media. If there had been distortion, if we found there had been distortion, we would examine the reason why that had occurred. If we found that there wasn't distortion, all bets were off, we would tell the story like anyone else. And we would, as I said earlier, we would have then been able to sell it to the highest bidder, and we would all have been much richer than we are today.
All right, Mr. Mills,
we did find there was distortion.
We have to take a break. We are going to talk about whether there was distortion more with our panel and our guests in a moment after a news update. That's ahead. So stay with us on Crime and Punishment, looking at the case of JonBenet Ramsey. For a year and a half, John and Pat denied any involvement in their daughter's murder. And once again, they're going public, this time in a British television documentary. That's our focus this hour on Crime and Punishment. Welcome back. I'm Dan Abrams. We are talking about, in part, the American media's treatment of John and Patsy Ramsey. And Geraldine Merritt, Chuck Green made a comment before saying that really the ones to blame here, if you want to blame someone for the way that's been covered, are the tabloids. You would have thought about that.
Yeah, and I disagree with that because I don't think most people consider Vanity Fair to be a tabloid. Yet the article that appeared in Vanity Fair about the Ramseys was filled with leaks from the police who had, made up their minds early on that the Ramseys had done this. There was information in there from a police officer that wasn't ever contained in his police reports. And it was an extremely unfair article, and that's not considered the National Enquirer.
And we must admit, we cover this case fairly often right here on the very non-tabloidish MSNBC. And I wanted to ask Mr. Mills about the issue of the American media coverage of this case. And, you are being somewhat hard on the American media, or at least the Ramseys are being hard on it. But the title of the documentary is Who Killed JonBenet for the British version and JonBenet's America for the American version. So doesn't that lead one to think this is a story about the JonBenet Ramsey investigation and not just about the media's coverage?
You're absolutely right, and both Mike Tracy and myself protested when Channel 4 decided to call it that. We wanted to call it in Britain as well, JonBenet's America, but it was pointed out to us that very few people in Britain would know who JonBenet was or would care very much about her America. For the British audience, it was a bad title, and so we couldn't think of a better one in the short time these sort of pressures occur in televisions. Yeah, you're right, we weren't happy with it. We didn't come up with anything better. In America, I desperately hope that we call it JonBenet's America, the American society in which she spent so few years of her life, because they did such harm to her parents.
Chuck Green, you want to make a comment?
Well, I find it rather amusing and somewhat lame to say that this is a critique of American media coverage of the case, and the title is Who Killed JonBenet, and the audience apparently in Britain doesn't even know who JonBenet is. I mean, that's just ludicrous.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the substance of this. We're talking a lot about this documentary, and I want to bring in a forensic psychologist, N.G. Beryl from New York, to talk a little bit about the psychology both surrounding this investigation and what Mr. Mills has described is people who he is convinced are either, in essence, pathological liars or they didn't do it. What is someone to take from that interpretation from a well-respected man who's been following the Ramseys for 5 days he spent with them? Is it possible that he's being fooled?
Of course it is. I mean, it's absolutely a fact that if you're dealing with people who, and we don't know this at this point, have committed a murder, if they are predisposed toward any kind of antisocial behavior, if their character structure is such, it'd be silly to say that one could ferret out a liar. I don't buy that.
But what can you tell? I mean, let's say that, you were able to watch this interview. You've watched the Ramseys in the press conference from May of 1997. What can you tell us from watching them? I mean, can you really say anything from just seeing them on TV?
I think you can. I think you'd be ill-advised to do so. Look, you know, from watching two parents who talk about the loss of a child, one naturally should feel some empathy. I guess the story has its bizarre twists and turns, and that's what I think that's what raises, you know, the American public's ire, I suppose, or suspicion. But you know, you can't ferret out the truth from looking at a TV show.
Geraldine.
You know, I think the American public's interest and fascination with this case is really more of a voyeuristic kind of fascination. I mean, it's because of the portrayal of JonBenet in the little outfits and in her pageants, and it's fascinating to the American public to watch. And I'm not critiquing it, you know, the pageantry so much as just saying I think that is really the reason that the country is focused on this child's murder more so than any other child that has been murdered. And with respect to how parents act after a murder occurs, even John Walsh, who is the father of Adam Walsh, who wrote a book on this kind of thing, said you can never judge anyone, any parent, by how they act after the commission of a crime.
But Norm, can't you? I mean, can't you at least use your common sense, though, in watching someone? We do it every day in courtrooms. You say to yourself, "I'm watching this person. I'm going to evaluate the person's credibility."
Sure, you do that on a constant basis, even outside the law. But the fact of the matter is, in this case, with this documentary, it was replete with this kind of testimony from friends and family. There were statements about the fact that, from John Ramsey, about the bicycle that he bought his daughter and how he wished, when she had asked him to let her ride it one more time that evening, he wishes he had done that. What does that have to do with the American media? Then there are friends and relatives saying there's no way that John and Patsy could do anything like this because of the kind of people they are. But what does that have to do with the American media? Neither one of them has anything to do with the American media. And I disagree with this blank slate contention that any journalist goes into any story without some feeling about what happened. And these people went in with a predetermined notion that the American media was unfair to the Ramseys, and that's one of the reasons we got the so-called documentary.
I have to give Mr. Mills a chance to respond to that. Mr. Mills, Norm Early is saying that it is clear that you went in with a predetermined notion the American media had been unfair. When you were asking the Ramseys to do this interview, did you say to them, you know what, you've been treated so unfairly by the American media, we will finally give you a chance?
No, of course we didn't say that. We didn't. We didn't know that for sure at the time when we interviewed them. But can I just come back on the earlier point? Of course you cannot judge someone's guilt from meeting them. I've met multiple killers who come over as absolutely charming. Of course you cannot. I said very earlier on that although my personal impression of them was that they were a very likable and couple who are not pathological liars but would be consummate actors, that had no relevance for the program we made, which was purely based on the evidence that we could put together. And in fact, when you say that the family has no value in evidence, the fact that that family has clung to them, the fact that the sister-in-law has clung to them, the former wife who John Ramsey divorced has clung to him, this does have some evidential value.
And Dan,
it's only partial.
Geraldine, but should that matter? I mean, what Mr. Mills was saying, should it matter that the rest of the family is still on their side?
Well, what's important here is that this couple has been investigated more than any other couple in the history of this country in the last year and a half, and nothing negative has turned up, yet the media keeps reporting negative things. And there is no evidence that these people ever had any abuse of this child, that there was anything wrong with it. They reported that there was some pornography found with John Ramsey, which was inaccurate.
But you have to concede that most of the reporting has been accurate. I mean, you can blame the media all you want, but the reality is almost all of the reporting, with a few exceptions.
I think there's a lot of exceptions.
All right, Chuck Green. Chuck Green, you've been reporting on this day in and day out.
95% of what's been reported on this case in the American media has been accurate, and in fact was contained as wait a minute. I've sat here for 20 minutes without interrupting you, okay? All of that material was contained again in this British documentary as factual background. All of it has been reported as fact in the American media. None of it was disputed in your own report. Number one. Number two, Greg McCrary, who is one of the most experienced homicide investigators in the United States, he was on the FBI serial murder team for many, many years, has said publicly that he has sat in prison cells interviewing hour after hour convicted mass murderers, and they almost have him convinced that they didn't do it. So for some TV producer to spend 5 days and I mean, it's crazy to conclude then that they, you know, that they are innocent of this
let's
crime.
ask him that, Mr. Mills. Let me ask you it again. Have you concluded?
Sorry, is Chuck listening? Is Chuck Green listening to nothing I'm saying? What I'm saying is that of course you cannot judge whether they did it or not on the way they behave. I've sat in prison cells talking to multiple killers, and of course you cannot. They do con you. That was not the point I was making. That was just a personal aside that I found them a rather likable couple who are either consummate
but that has nothing to do with the evidence in this case.
Absolutely not. I agree. I wasn't making
the evidence in this case, according to the detectives who have investigated it, points to the Ramseys as the most likely people under the police-described umbrella of suspicion.
But Chuck,
We've got 2 lawyers here.
That's where the evidence leads.
We've got 2 lawyers here battling to get in. We'll let them in. We'll let them at each other. We'll let them at Chuck. We'll be back in a minute with more on the investigation into the death of JonBenet Ramsey. Stay with us. We're back with Crime and Punishment. Our focus, the JonBenet Ramsey investigation. We've been talking in part about what it is that John and Patsy Ramsey did with JonBenet Ramsey when she was growing up. And many people have said that JonBenet Ramsey attending beauty pageants was a little bit much for a 6-year-old girl. People have said, how could a mother actually do that? Well, John Ramsey spoke to that in the interview that he did with a British documentary that we're talking about today. And here's what he said in that documentary. He said, it was a fun thing for Patsy and JonBenet to do together as mother and daughter. I felt that Patsy was probably particularly anxious to do those kinds of things with JonBenet because, quite frankly, she had cancer in remission and didn't know if she would be around when JonBenet was 16 and 18. Norm Early, that sounds like a pretty legitimate defense.
I agree with you. There's a legitimate defense, but that was followed up with the question about whether or not this was a sexualization of their daughter, JonBenet. Patsy Ramsey's response to that was that only sick minds would believe that this was a sexualization of their daughter. And judging by the videotape that has been splattered across everyone's video screen, everyone's TV screen, there are probably a lot of sick minds out there. They justify this as just being a pageant in front of parents and grandparents. There was no sexualization, and there was no follow-up to that response, saying, are you sure that this is not a sexualization? How can you say that when so many people feel it is?
Geraldine, what about the fact that people are disturbed by the fact that JonBenet Ramsey was going to these beauty pageants sort of all done up as if she was an adult? And do you think that that has become one of the reasons that you say that the American public has turned against the Ramseys?
I think it is one of the reasons, but I think that the Ramseys would say that it wasn't a big part of JonBenet's life. It's all we ever see of her, but that she didn't even attend all that many pageants. Also, we're looking at isolated pictures of one girl from the pageant. But when these pageants are conducted, all of the little girls are dressed up that way, and it may not have the same effect or the same impact if you're viewing 30 girls all doing the same thing as opposed to one little girl, JonBenet, over and over and over again. Individually, she does look sexualized. She does look looking older. But, you know, I'm not sure that that was their purpose, and I think only a sick mind would, and that may be the real key here, because it may be who killed her.
Let's talk to our forensic psychologist about what a sick mind might do or might not do. What's your take on this? I mean, a 6-year-old going to beauty pageants, is that disturbing from a psychological point of view?
I don't know if it's disturbing, but I think 2 issues are at hand. One is that it raises the question of, you know, people's, generally speaking, their values about these sorts of things. I think a lot of people are offended by these photographs, and in feeling this kind of, the recoil when they see this little girl dressed up like an adult, they find that distasteful. On that level, there's a value issue. Secondly, from perhaps a more psychological or behavioral issue, if you're questioning the Ramseys themselves, it begins to suggest, you know, what is the relationship that the folks had with their kid? And I think that's where the meat of the issue might lie. In other words, you speculate, is she a child that was merely objectified by the parents? You know, these are the questions that people need.
Doctor, let me ask you one question here. I mean, Patsy Ramsey herself was in pageants. She was a former Miss West Virginia. I mean, if you put that into the equation, wouldn't that tend to lessen the thought that she might be of someone of a sick mind to do this with her daughter?
Well, yeah, I'm not using the term sick mind. It raises, look, for me, it raises a host of other questions, such as, is she living out, you know, sort of fantasies of faded glory through this child and thus is not making a genuine connection to the kid? These are the kind of, perhaps, more sophisticated questions that could be asked.
Well, doctor, we're talking about a connection with the kid. Friends, relatives, all indicate that JonBenet was a bedwetter. She had rubber sheets on her bed, which would also indicate that she's probably a bedwetter. But when John Ramsey was asked in this interview about her being a bedwetter, he said he did not know that his daughter was a bedwetter and did not believe that she was. Now, does that indicate some kind of lack of connection with his child?
Well, if that is indeed a fact, one would have to ask, given statements about intimacy and, you know, the close relationship between father and daughter, how one would miss such a glaring fact. If you're a parent and have had to get up in the middle of the night and change a kid's bed or deal with that, you certainly don't forget that issue.
And David Mills, did you follow up on that sort of,
yes,
with those sort of questions?
We followed up on that issue, and what he said was that he didn't think that she had very much of a bedwetting problem. And indeed, we know that it wasn't a great problem, and that it's actually relatively common. I forget the exact proportions, maybe 20, 30, 40% of young girls of that age occasionally wet their beds. It's part of growing up for that proportion of children. And what we know is that the medical records show that the concern and the reason that, one of the reasons that JonBenet was taken to a pediatrician was her mum's concern about the embarrassment to JonBenet about this. There was there is no evidence, we were unable to find any evidence that her mother was herself concerned about
well,
the
did you feel that
she was concerned for JonBenet? That's the evidence.
Did you feel that John?
I'm going to let you ask that question, Norm, in just a moment. We need to take another break. We'll talk more about this new interview with John and Patsy Ramsey when we come back on Crime and Punishment. Stay with us.
You may be eluding the authorities for a time, but God knows who you are, and we will find you.
Again, Patsy Ramsey back in May of 1997. She and her husband, John, have now spoken out again to a British television documentary. We've been talking with the producer of that, with our lawyers here in the studio, with Chuck Green, who is a columnist for the Denver Post, and with a forensic psychologist. Chuck, I want to go back to you. You've been somewhat critical of this documentary. If you could have asked one question or one series of questions that you think weren't asked, or that you think should have been put in the broadcast, what would they have been?
Well, let me return to what was said just before the break there regarding, and this is an example of what I would have asked, regarding this pageant business. John Ramsey said in the British broadcast that this was a very important relationship between Patsy and JonBenet because Patsy was suffering from cancer, didn't know how long she would live, and so the pageants were a way for them to bond and spend time together with this daughter. Well, that contradicts what the Ramseys said about the pageants a year ago. The contradiction was never followed up in this so-called documentary. Last year they said the pageants were no big deal. It was a couple of Sunday afternoons, quote unquote. That is a contradiction. And the British broadcast team never pointed out those contradictions, never followed up on that kind of thing. They just sat back and let the Ramseys talk.
David Mills, did you follow up on contradictions? And how much do you think that you had people who knew the details of this case, as well as someone like Chuck Green, who anytime someone mentions something, someone could say, wait a second, there's a follow-up question there?
Yes, absolutely. We had a team of two brilliant American journalists, Dan Glick and Sherry Keane Osborne from Newsweek, who know every single detail. Their minds are like encyclopedias on this case, and they kept on putting me right on small details. But in fact, I know the transcripts of that interview better than anyone. I've spent a lot of time going through it, and there is no contradiction between what they were saying. They were continually saying that it was a fun thing for them to do. Grandma was there. It was not only Patsy Ramsey herself who was a beauty queen, her sister was a beauty queen, also Miss Colorado.
All right, Norma, you've heard those tape. You've heard the tape.
David, you just proved my point, because Dan Glick and Sherry Keane Osborne were selected to be advisors on this project, and they are two of the individuals in the media in Colorado who have been seen to be most pro-Ramsey.
How about
you
Ferris?
did not select individuals who did not have a predisposed notion to come to the conclusion that you wanted to come to.
To respond to the evidence is to be, in this case, accused of being pro-Ramsey. We would have reported whatever the evidence suggested. We looked very hard for the evidence.
But you cannot discard your personal prism.
But you're confusing being fair and being favorable. And you know, they're trying to be fair in their coverage, and the Newsweek reporters are fair. If that turns out to be favorable,
but Gerald, this dispels the blank slate notion. Nobody went into this project with a blank slate. Everyone went into it with their own ideas about the coverage in this case,
well, we should
whether
all go
it's been
into
good
it
or
with
bad.
the notion of the presumption of innocence, because that's what our criminal justice system is about.
We're not talking about presumption of innocence here. We're talking about the coverage by the American media,
and that
whether it was fair
the
or
Ramseys
unfair.
the presumption
now,
of innocence.
if you had had a Chuck Green on this team, you probably would have had a much more different documentary than you have today, instead of Dan Glick.
But this isn't about who killed JonBenet. It's about whether or not the Ramseys have been treated fairly in the media.
David Mills, is it possible that if you had, for example, let's take Chuck Green as an example. Let's assume that you and Chuck suddenly became good friends, and you had hired him. Would your documentary have been different, or could it have been different?
Not at all. The 3, 4, 5, 6... in fact, we had a journalist working with us who believed that the Ramseys were guilty. He went through all the evidence. He produced a marvellous brief for us on every single... We commissioned him to do so on every single fact, every single article that had been written about them.
Who was that, David?
All right, let's get away from the details, though, of the reporters, because the public is not that familiar. Can we just get back to the key point?
Mr.
Mills, though, go ahead, very, very quickly.
Yeah. The story that the Ramseys sexualized their daughter, that they sexually abused their daughter, that they then murdered her, and that they then used their wealth and privileged position to escape justice. That story was going to sell around the world. Journalists who ran with that story were going to do well. Those journalists who ran with the opposite story, they didn't do it, or the evidence didn't support that, were going to get very little coverage.
That's the reality of the 20 seconds for each side. Geraldine Merritt, what does this documentary say about the investigation, and how does it fit in?
The documentary says that the Ramseys have not been treated fairly by the American press. The American people have been led to believe that the Ramseys never cooperated and that there's no evidence of an intruder. The media reports that constantly, when in fact the Ramseys did cooperate with the district attorney's office by providing everything they asked for, including searches of their residences, including hair, blood, saliva samples, and the fact that there is plenty of evidence of an intruder.
You're out of time, Geraldine. Norm, 20 seconds.
There was an opportunity here to get a balanced and unbiased view of what was occurring in this case. I think based upon the composition of the team and their predetermined attitudes, we did not get a balanced and unbiased approach. We got a very biased and unbalanced documentary.
Norm Early, Geraldine Merritt, David Mills, Chuck Green, I want to thank you all for joining us here on this edition of Crime and Punishment as we looked into the investigation of JonBenet Ramsey. Thanks for joining us.